I'm Grant Rhode, an affiliated scholar of the Center for the Study of Asia of the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. Welcome to this book talk by Jonathan Hillman, followed by discussion remarks by Philippe and Mignet before the session is open for a question and answer period. This session marks the launch of the Pardee School virtual program, Assessing China's Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI. Talks in this series will be available on the Pardee School website. All of the regional and topical centers of the Pardee School will participate in this program. This event is sponsored by the Center for the Study of Europe. Indeed, the impetus for this event came from the Center for the Study of Europe's director, Daniela Caruso, who unfortunately cannot be with us today due to conflicting teaching responsibilities. Many thanks to Daniela and to Elizabeth Amrien of the CSE for organizing this session. Let me begin by introducing the speakers before turning the presentation over to them. Jonathan Hillman is a senior fellow with the CSIS economics program and director of the Reconnecting Asia project, one of the most extensive open source databases tracking China's Belt and Road Initiative. He is a graduate of Brown University and the Harvard Kennedy School and has worked in Kyrgyzstan as a Fulbright scholar. He has testified before Congress and written on economics, national security, and foreign policy for CSIS, the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. Today, he will talk to us about his new book, The Emperor's New Road, China and the Project of the Century. The book is fresh, having been released 2 weeks ago by Yale University Press. Philippe is a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School and an associate in research at the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies, although he is joining us today from Paris. He has been a fellow at both the Brookings Institution and at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He is a former official in the French Ministry of Defense, following 10 years as a foreign correspondent based in Asia. He holds graduate degrees in Asian studies and in political science from the Sorbonne. Of his 4 books, most relevant to this discussion is China's Offensive in Europe, published by Brookings in 2016. He is currently working on a new book, focusing especially on China's influence in Southern and Eastern Europe. He plans to return to talk about this work in the spring semester as part of this series on the BRI. Mignet is Associate Professor of International Relations in the Pardee School of Global Studies. Dr. Yer was director of the East Asian Studies program at Boston University from 2010 through 2014, and she launched the new major in Asian Studies at BU. While pursuing her research agenda, she has also served as visiting scholar at major universities in China, India, Hong Kong, and Singapore. She holds degrees from Beijing University, the University of South Carolina, and Princeton University. Of her 3 books, most relevant to this discussion is her analysis of China's domestic and historical roots of the BRI, The Belt, Road, and Beyond, State-Mobilized Globalization in China, 1998 through 2018, published by Cambridge University Press earlier in 2020. She has talked about the Belt, Road, and Beyond as part of this BRI series launch. We are fortunate today to have panelists with us who have literally written the books on China's Belt and Road Initiative from American, European, and Chinese perspectives. In his book, Jonathan Hillman early on cites the parable of the blind men and the elephant, in which each blind man touches the elephant and describes the elephant differently depending on which part of the elephant he touches. Thus, accounts from different perspectives, such as those written by our panelists, will help us to understand different parts of the elephant. Jonathan's book is holistic, giving us a powerful overall feel for the international relations elephant in the room, the BRI 7 years after its birth. His engaging account is replete with adventure as he weaves his stories of visiting BRI sites in Asia, Africa, and Europe, along with historic precedents, into his analysis of many dimensions of BRI implementation on 3 continents and on the seas surrounding them. Jonathan will talk for about 30 minutes and Philippe and Min for about 15 minutes each before the question and answer period. For those listening who have a question, please write it in the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Please identify yourself by name and institution as introduction to your question. We will try to get to as many of the questions as we can after the discussant remarks. Jonathan Hillman refers to the BRI as the project of the century. John, please tell us about your book, why you wrote it, and what conclusions you have reached to date in your assessment of China's Belt and Road Initiative. Welcome to Boston University. I hear that you will share some images with us, and I look forward to seeing them.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Grant, for organizing this. Thank you also to Daniela, who I know was not able to make it, and Elizabeth for helping us pull this off. And especially thank you to Min and Philippe. Your work was incredibly helpful, remains very helpful as I try to think more about what this Belt and Road is and what it isn't. And let me start off by recognizing that what the Belt and Road is today is not what the Belt and Road was when it was announced, and probably is not what it will be, if we convene again in February, March, or April to talk about this. So this is a very fluid initiative. My account in this book focuses primarily on the time period between the two Belt and Road forums. So the first of those announced with great fanfare in Beijing, I think of as the sort of Belt and Road 1.0. A lot of projects being pushed out the door, lots of MOUs being signed. The more recent forum last year, there was a little bit of a little more nuance in how the Belt and Road was presented by Chinese officials, and I think an indication that they are both aware of some of the criticisms that have been made about this effort, as well as trying to, in some ways, adapt it. So what I'm going to talk about today focuses primarily on that period, although I do want to touch a little bit on how the pandemic has been impacting the Belt and Road and what to expect going forward. Let me just share my screen here. I've got a few slides to help walk us through this. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see that. Okay, and what I'd like to do today is I'd like to cover 3 parts. The first part is really just to give a bit of context. How does Europe fit into China's Belt and Road? The book that I wrote talks about projects in Asia, Europe, and in East Africa, but I know we're going to focus today primarily on Europe. And so I think it's just helpful to kind of set the scene and talk about how Europe fits into this bigger picture. Then I want to turn briefly to consider some impacts on the ground, because I do think that there is a gap between how the Belt and Road is often advertised in grand fora like Belt and Road forums, in the maps that we are sometimes familiar with or see, or introductions to the Belt and Road. There's a gap between those initial impressions and how projects are actually playing out on the ground. And so I'd like to just look at 2 projects that I think highlight different drivers and will have different impacts, both in Europe. And then finally, as I mentioned, I do want to briefly think about the road ahead here. How is the Belt and Road changing, particularly in the aftermath of the pandemic? And what can we expect in terms of projects going forward, different areas of emphasis from the Chinese side, from participating countries. And so I'll try to just touch on that briefly as well. So to help situate us here, I think that this map is, in one sense, useful, in some other senses not so useful. This is a map that was modeled off a very early version of a Belt and Road map that was put out by Xinhua, and it both understates what the Belt and Road is in some respects, and in other respects it overstates what the Belt and Road is. So it understates what the Belt and Road is in the sense that the Belt and Road touches much more than what we see in this on this map. It touches the Arctic, it touches now Latin America, it touches cyberspace and even outer space. And so I'm not sure that we could even make a single map to capture what the Belt and Road is today. But yet in another respect, I think it overstates what the Belt and Road is. We see on this map something that's, I think, a familiar framing device often used to describe the Belt and Road, and these big corridors swooping across the supercontinent of Eurasia. And I think a theme that comes out of my book and that I'd like to touch on today is that it's quite easy to draw these big swooping corridors on a map. It's an entirely another thing to bring them about, to build the infrastructure that you need to create real, economic flows. And in some areas, projects are coming online. In other areas, these corridors remain, I think, mostly imaginary, and haven't even been defined below the level of a country. They're not detailed in the sense of saying city A, B, and C with these related roads and rail projects. So still a lot of definition to be done there. But I think there's a gap there between what we often see initially and what's actually happening on the ground. And as we look at this map, I think one of the helpful things this does capture is that in many respects, the EU, Western Europe, is the prize at the end of the road, at least the road as it passes through the Eurasian supercontinent. You have the largest markets there. Chinese companies want access to them. Chinese contractors would like to be able to do projects within the EU, have in the past struggled to gain those opportunities. And so in order to get access, they are also, I think, learning, gaining experience in the sort of periphery around Europe. And so I think that's a very, very important area to watch. But again, just providing some overall context here. And there's been a range of reactions within the EU and, frankly, around the world in terms of countries deciding to participate in this. If so, in what capacity? This is a map that was put out, I think, just yesterday by Brookings. And in dark blue, we have countries that have signed MOUs to participate in the Belton Road. And in the sort of lighter blue, you have cooperation agreements that have been signed. So this gives you, and they count 138 countries globally that have now done either an MOU or a participation agreement. So that's most of the world. Most of the world is participating in the Belton Road. And I think, so the holdouts at this point it's probably more significant to have not signed something than it is to have signed something at this point. And you see some holdouts in Western Europe. I also want to say, I think early on, signing an MOU, I think, was a more important indicator of, as a political signal. But the more of these that have been signed, and at least the more of them that I've seen the text of, I tend to think that these are pretty weak agreements, and we shouldn't make too much about them. There's some symbolic value, but when countries like Italy sign an MOU, it literally says in the text, this is not a legally binding agreement. So this is not, these MOUs being signed should not be in any way compared to, a trade deal being done between two countries or more than two countries. Another telling characteristic of these agreements are that it is a sea of bilateral deals. And so although the Belton Road sometimes convenes events, and I'll talk about one mechanism that it does that with in a moment, convenes these events that give the impression of multilateralism, a lot of the real deals are still being done bilaterally. That presents opportunities for China, but also some limitations in terms of its overall impact. This is one mechanism that I think is very relevant to our conversation today, our focus on Europe. This is the 17+1. It's sometimes called a format. It's sometimes called a grouping. Sometimes called a mechanism. I think the fact that you have different variations for describing it, at least initially, illustrates how there's been some difficulty analytically pinning down what this thing is, what it really does, what its capabilities and limits are. But this is a grouping that actually predates the Belton Road. So I believe initially rolled out in 2012. Initially as the 16+1 with 11 EU members, 5 non-EU members, and then China, of course, being the +1. And I think this is it's been from China's perspective, I think a very savvy way of organizing and doing business. You can very efficiently, if you're a Chinese official, bring together these leaders of these countries, do business, and I think it's been a mechanism that has been similar mechanisms have been used in other regions by China, including Africa and Latin America. But again, important to, I think, distinguish between some of the fanfare around this and some of its limitations as an actual construct. Although statements will be made at these summits about the importance of upholding multilateralism, again, in reality, the real deals, most of them overwhelmingly are bilateral deals. And now you also start to see, you have seen over the past year and change, a little bit more hesitancy, especially among some of the EU participants in this group. And so you have some countries like Poland, the Czech Republic, Lithuania, Estonia, I think in some ways reconsidering their participation in this, not wanting to anger the Chinese and pulling out from this, but not as enthusiastic as they were up front. And part of that, I think, sort of that lack of enthusiasm stems from the fact that a lot of the projects that have been announced, a lot of the activity in this grouping has gone mainly to the non-EU members. That makes sense, I think, for several reasons. The EU members have access to other sources of financing. They're less risky environments, and present in some respects a higher bar for Chinese companies to clear and operate in. And so the non-EU members are, in that sense, have greater unmet needs and are easier for some of China's companies to do business with. So there's a practical reality there. But I think you do have a fragmentation of this 17+1 group emerging with some of the countries that I mentioned in the EU less enthusiastic. But you still have an iron core of countries that are quite interested in this, and in that category, I would include Greece, Hungary, and Serbia. And I'm going to, in a minute, just turn to two projects that involve those countries who I think are still very interested in participating in the Belt and Road, including through this and other ways. So the first project, many people will have heard of this, is actually, let me go back here a second just to orient us. So on this map, you can see at the bottom of the map, we've got a dot for the port of Piraeus. That'll be the first project that I talk about just briefly. And then north of that, you see that checkered white line. That is a proposed rail project between Belgrade in Serbia and Budapest in Hungary, and that'll be the second project I talk about. These are big projects. They're not the only projects that go on, and so I have to admit to a bias there and focusing on these. For every port of Piraeus or Belgrade to Budapest railway, there is a small road project that you probably won't ever hear about, and so I'll admit the bias up front to focusing on these larger projects. But focusing for a moment on Piraeus port, this is a part of the world that has been the site of great power competition in the past. This is a photo I took about 2 years ago when I had an opportunity to visit the port, and it's a billboard that's on the side of a warehouse near the port that might be turned into something else, potentially hotels in the future, to cater to cruise ships that are coming in. But a sense of history here. This was the focal point of a struggle between great powers. China came in and runs the port without a shot fired, right? And I think that's a important distinction in the world and how it exists today, and the world as it existed when China's predecessors pursued foreign territory, did projects abroad. So China has much more constraints but is able to use economic tools effectively. Now runs 2 out of 3 terminals at the port of Piraeus, and has done a very successful job commercially turning this port around. And to me, this is probably, if not the most successful commercial project associated with the Belton Road, certainly one of them. You can see in this figure, the pandemic has taken a little bit of a toll on all ports, basically, with one exception there. But really, there's been this incredible growth. Compare 2007, Piraeus was 17 out of 15 in Europe in terms of its throughput. And you go ahead to 2019 and it's number 4. And so just incredible growth since Costco, a Chinese state-owned enterprise, has taken over there. And I think this is a good example of a project that has been commercially successful with political benefits. And so some of those benefits on the commercial side, we often focus just on the port of Piraeus, just in terms of the containers that are coming in and out, although that is like the heart of the operation. There's this constellation of other economic activities that the port has put into motion. So, we often don't think of ports as having digital infrastructure, although they do. And so Huawei has redone the network at the port of Piraeus and offers, I think, free Wi-Fi if you're coming in on a cruise ship there. A whole constellation of other companies, the Bank of China setting up an office in Greece, in large part to do lending related to the maritime sector. Chinese airlines announcing direct flights in order to cater to the tourism that, again, is coming in and out of some of the cruise ship services there. China State Grid is interested in doing, has been pursuing projects that connect Piraeus, connect Greece and nearby Greek islands. So this has been, I think, in a way, a foothold, a commercial foothold that has given birth to these other activities. Again, very, very commercially successful. And it's become, this is where the political benefits come in. This become a showpiece for Chinese leaders when they're in the area, or to just, frankly, arrange a visit just for the express purpose of going to Piraeus, and to not just bask in the success, but to bring sometimes leaders from other countries with them, and to give them the hint of, if you partner with us, this is what you might be able to achieve. And it's become, in that sense, a very compelling sales pitch for the possibility of participating in the Belton Road. And yet there are still limits to the influence that this gives China, and I think those are worth noting as well. Just the nature of modern ports are such that frankly, you don't need many people to run them. If you ever go to a port, it's almost a mechanized symphony with very few people, and the impact that has in the countries that are hosting the port might be at odds. The commercial success of the port might sometimes be at odds with how locals feel about it, because if you need fewer people, that's fewer jobs for locals. And so the political and commercial incentives there are not always aligned. Always clearly better to have a well-functioning port than not. But you also, I think, have, as indicated by polls of Greek citizens, still very mixed feelings about China, and yes, wanting to benefit from economic engagement with China, but at the same time being somewhat skeptical of Chinese environmental standards, labor standards. So even as successful as this project has been, and there have been some local dynamics as well that have workers groups and politicians creating some obstacles to expand the port. So if this is the best case of a commercially successful project, it does convey certain types of influence, but it is not a panacea, and there are still limits to that influence. The second project that I wanted to highlight, again, I don't think this will not come as news to anyone, but this is a big project, a proposed railway between Belgrade and Budapest. I talk about this in the book. I took the existing railway from Belgrade to Budapest, which is long and slow and not very luxurious. And so on the one hand, I can see the need to upgrade this line. And yet, when you start to look at some of the specifics around it, it raises lots of red flags about whether this is really how this amount of money should be spent and to whose benefit is this project being built. So an agreement was signed for this project in 2014. It was initially announced as a high-speed bullet train by some media. It has since been, the specifications have since slowed, I think, to the point that conventional standards wouldn't call it a high-speed rail. It will be much faster. It would be much faster than the existing railway. But I think that difference, although it might seem technical, the difference between what's really high speed and what's not, might seem somewhat trivial. I think it's interesting because it highlights, one of the big incentives for doing these sorts of projects for the leaders that are involved in them, and that's it's what sociologists sometimes refer to as the technological sublime. This is the thrill that planners and politicians get from announcing the latest technology, and being able to have superlatives that accompany your project. So that's why you sometimes have the longest bridge, the fastest train, the tallest building. These are even if they aren't commercially useful, they're very politically appealing. And so the nature, I think, of a label, just high-speed train, has that allure to it. So after this project was announced in 2017, the European Commission launched an investigation to look into the Hungarian side of the railway. The concern being that a tender had been awarded to a Chinese company without any open competition, that being against EU procurement rules. And the way that has been resolved has been, I think, somewhat concerning. So the consortia, a bid was, the process, the tender was redone. The consortia that won it includes a Chinese company as well as the childhood friend of Viktor Orban. And so you have, I think, a pretty clear or somewhat suspicious case of, people being close to people in power benefiting from this project. And more recently, the details of the project, some details of the project have been classified, and so I think the Hungarian Parliament did that and justified it by saying that it was required in order to meet the conditions for the financing that China Exim Bank was providing. So that is another theme that I think comes out in the book. This is not a challenge limited to Hungary, but the opaque process around some of these projects, while it I think can allow some projects to proceed faster in the shorter term, it does open the door to opportunities for corruption and opportunities for projects that frankly might not be viable to proceed. This is a picture of the place where the train would leave on the Serbian side. So this is a new rail station that was built in Belgrade, and it's totally outside of existing transport connections in the city. So in order to get there, you have to take a bus or a taxi. And one of the leading transportation experts who in the U.S. who's actually a native of Belgrade referred to this as the biggest transportation disaster in Belgrade. And so this is, you know, a project that the planning of this, even though this rail link is still relatively not very far along, some of the early signs we're seeing do not instill confidence. And the basic math behind high-speed rail projects working is challenging. So there's sort of a ballpark estimate for how long these projects need to be in order to work. If they're too long, you might as well take a plane. If they're too short, you might as well drive. The length of this project actually fits the ballpark for what might be feasible. But what's concerning is some of the lack of demand. Given how much this project is estimated to cost, they would need somewhere between 6 million and 9 million passengers a year to use the service, which is basically every man, woman, and child in Belgrade and Budapest buying 2 tickets every year to do 6 million passengers. And according to a Serbian academic, this project, not even factoring in maintenance costs, his ballpark estimate is that it would take 2,500 years to make a profit. So, you know, I'm sure we could question some of the assumptions under some of these estimates, but I think it does underscore that a lot is being spent here, perhaps without the commercial case that you would want. And this is I think a very clever development. This is going back to one of the themes I mentioned in the beginning about, I think we need to question what some of these corridors are. It's been announced that there's this idea of connecting the port in Piraeus with the rail project that goes from Belgrade to Budapest. And it makes sense if you're just looking at a map, right? Why not connect these things? But I think we need to start asking some questions about when we see these maps, because there's quite a bit of terrain between Belgrade and Piraeus. So what does that infrastructure look like right now? How much would it cost? Excuse me. How much would it cost to upgrade the hundreds of miles of rail between Belgrade and Piraeus, or to get it into a condition that it would allow for this land-sea express route to function? But I haven't seen many people, you know, asking those questions. But it is, I think, a very clever way of linking a project that has been very commercially successful, Port of Piraeus, with a project that is commercially dubious, which is this rail project. So I think there's an art to doing that, but I think, you know, as analysts, we should dig a bit deeper and ask some questions about whether the commercial fundamentals are here for this idea. Just briefly, I do want to just spend a minute or two on the road ahead. It's worth noting that the Belton Road, even before the pandemic, Belton Road related activity was declining. So the peak was probably 2016, 2017 in terms of project activity, had pulled back in 2018, definitely in 2019. And now the pandemic has pulled that activity back even further. And it's constrained the ability of participating countries to borrow and to do these projects. And it is, it's certainly, it's challenging China's ability to do some of these projects as well. In that context, I think that what we will see, what we're starting to see, is a greater emphasis on digital infrastructure in the Belt and Road. And this is driven by several factors. I mentioned the fact that countries have less capacity to borrow. ICT infrastructure projects, digital infrastructure projects they tend to cost less than the large transport and energy projects that have really characterized the Belt and Road's first phase. And so in that sense, they might be sometimes more feasible financially for countries to proceed with. There's also, I think, a pretty strong incentive on the Chinese side, because as Chinese technology companies face greater scrutiny in advanced economies, markets that they, for many years, they were hoping to succeed in order to continue to grow, I think they'll want to double down in developing and emerging markets, in markets like Serbia. And so this is an example, this picture here is an example of a project that's been done in Serbia. It's a smart city project. So it includes a little over 1,000 surveillance cameras with facial recognition and license plate recognition capabilities. And you can understand, if you're the mayor of Belgrade, you can understand the appeal of doing a smart city project. Someone comes in and they're going to tell you, I can reduce your crime rate, I can make traffic more efficient, I can during the pandemic, I can help you identify people with fevers and do contact tracing. I mean, all of these wonderful things that you could do with this technology, and we're going to finance it for you. And so really it's going to pay for itself. I mean, it's a sales pitch that I think would appeal in many cities around the world. And unfortunately, I don't think there's been as much scrutiny on whether the benefits that are promised are actually being delivered. There's certainly been scrutiny about some of the security risks from using some of this equipment. And this project in particular was rolled out without a lot of details being released publicly. A case study was posted on the Huawei website and then removed. Civil society groups in Belgrade have, I think, done the right thing and tried to ask for more information. They've cataloged where these cameras are. But the way that this was done, and still some of the questions that are outstanding about it, are somewhat concerning. But these types of projects, smart city projects or safe city projects, as some of the Chinese technology companies call them, I think will continue to be popular in emerging and developing markets. And so this is another area where I think the US, Europe, and others should be thinking about trying to offer better alternatives. Another, I think, potentially big development here, as the pipeline for Belt and Road projects becomes smaller, there's, I think, an opportunity for more quality control on the Chinese side. There's also, I think, a desire to share some of the reputational and financial risk that China has assumed in the sort of first phase of Belt and Road. And so I see, a lot of interest in trying to get more partners involved in these projects, whether that's from the private sector, trying to get financing from companies like HSBC, or trying to bring in other multilaterals. There's a new facility that's been stood up at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank to help coordinate activities among multilateral development banks. And that's another avenue through which I think the Chinese officials could both learn some of the practices that those other development banks have been using, as well as maybe partner with them in some ways to share financial and reputational risk. So those I think are two important trends. There are others, and so in closing, let me just mention these. Maybe we'll get into these during the Q&A. I think given the pandemic, there's a lot of deals being renegotiated right now, and so this is the year, I think, of the great renegotiation. As much time, or if not more, being spent renegotiating deals as negotiating new deals. And there are lots of coordination challenges in doing that, both internationally, working with the IMF, the World Bank, and others, but even the set of Chinese creditors that are involved in these projects, in some cases, don't seem to be on the same page. And the coordination challenge there of trying to get them to participate in debt relief for developing countries in particular. The Health Silk Road is something that was a footnote in the Belt and Road until earlier this year. Happy to talk more about that, but has been it's been a more prominent part of agreements and statements since then. I think it's worth asking how much of that is rhetoric and what parts of it are actually projects. What projects can we point to? And then this is given our focus on Europe today, and given I think lots of interest in trying to provide better, competitive alternatives to Chinese projects. This is another area where I know there's a lot of interest, some initial steps, but still much more to be done. And so that's another area that we could talk about. So let me leave it there, and thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for that rich presentation. And Philippe Corre, I'd like to welcome you to Boston University as well. And I know that you've been working on many of the issues that Jonathan has talked about. And so please give us your reaction to these comments and to his book.
Thank you very much. And thank you to Daniela, Elizabeth, yourself, Grant, for being such great hosts at the Pardee School. I've read Jonathan's book with great interest. It's a very well-researched and well-written book, so congratulations. And I've particularly enjoyed the Europe part. And I've also read some of Mingyé's book, work, and I've listened to her a talk at the Ash Center quite recently. So I have to say here that I'm the only one not to have written a book on the Belton Road, so I feel somewhat weaker, but that sort of feeds my own narrative, so to speak. What I want to talk about really is how I envision the Belton Road as being more of a part of a global strategy rather than being the Chinese strategy itself, and that we may have some diverging views on this, but I believe it's been one of the tools that China has been using over the past few years to expand and to come to center stage, as Secretary General Xi Jinping has been saying. The other thing is, of course, the BRI was originally a European project, or at least the main destination for the BRI in 2013 was Europe. And in fact, I looked at one of Jonathan's maps, and it says that Madrid and Rotterdam are final destinations, but you've read in other papers and reports and on other maps that Duisburg is a final destination. The Brits say that London is a final destination. The Portuguese, at some point said that Lisbon was going to be a destination. Although, in fact, the port of Sines in Portugal could also be one, since it's on the Atlantic. So it's of course very confusing. But the reality is that there's little evidence of success of the BRI in Europe. There are few BRI projects per se, and Piraeus, was started to be negotiated much before we ever heard about the BRI. And depending on what Chinese documents you read, it's either a Chinese investment in Europe, or in Greece for that matter, or a Belt and Road project to be included in the Belton Road. Same thing with the Budapest-Belgrade train line, which, by the way, I was impressed with the photo you took of that train station, because my last trip to Belgrade, there wasn't a place to photograph. Although maybe it was already quite far away to travel, but it's also a very slow start, and there's much ambiguity about what could happen to this project. My feeling, I'll come to that maybe later also, is that a country like Greece has somewhat changed gears and is now much more looking towards the EU and the US than China. And that really also one of the problems with Chinese investments and relations with Western countries is that there are elections. And whenever you have a new election, well, of course, a new government, then you know, they can go one way or the other. Secondly, there is a reality that most Chinese FDI, foreign direct investments, including those by state-owned enterprises, have been targeting non-BRI countries. Between 2000 and 2018, the biggest recipients of cumulative investments have been the UK, 55 billion euro, Germany, 26 billion euro, France, 18 billion euro, and even countries like Spain, Sweden, Denmark are seeing rising investments, or have seen in the past rising investments. None of them sign a BRI MOU. And among the top European countries, the only BRI country, so to speak, which has received a significant portion of FDI is Italy. But on this, there's a lot to say about the MOU that was signed 18 months ago, because in fact, there's almost no concrete result of this MOU. I've visited Trieste, I've visited Genoa, I've spoken to a lot of people in Italy. And of course, COVID-19 may be one of the reasons for that. But in fact, my visit was prior to the pandemic. So I don't think, you know, not much was on the way anyway. Third, what about these areas of influence that you described, Jonathan, the 17+1? Well, that may be a success in terms of Chinese diplomacy, but it's not considered a success by the 17+1 members when it comes to receiving Chinese investments, particularly. And, you know, there's even some frustration in many cases for not actually getting the dividends of these, of being either a member of the 17+1 or having signed an MOU for the Belton Road. But you wrote in the book that MOUs don't carry much value, at least the majority of them. Which leads me to Europe's reaction. And as mentioned in the book, the EU has been getting its act together. And you now have a screening mechanism, not against the BRI, but against foreign investments in sensitive areas by the European Union. And in fact, this mechanism just started early this week. So it's a very fresh process, which was announced a long time ago, but it's actually now being implemented. And it's actually, you know, looking at cases of sensitive technologies as well as sensitive infrastructures. So this may be sort of BRI related. There's another aspect from the European reaction is the EU connectivity strategy, which has the aim of increasing links between Asia and Europe. So you can see there's a sort of competing idea there. You may say that the Europeans are latecomers, but at least, you know, in countries where I heard myself people saying, you know, where is Brussels? Where is Berlin? Where is Paris? At least there is now an alternative to the Chinese initiative. And the broad objectives of this connectivity strategy are creating transport links, energy, digital networks, offering connectivity partnerships to countries in Asia. That includes Central Asia, in fact, and promoting sustainable finance. And finally, on this European reaction, there's been a new strategy that was announced in spring 2019, which really was more critical of China than ever before, and that calls China a systemic rival, among other things. It's also calling China a partner and a competitor. But all this to say that there's very little sign that the EU, as a group of 27 countries, is planning on joining the Belt and Road. And there are indeed a number of countries that have signed MOUs, once again, but it's not going to lead to a sort of association. At least I don't see that coming in the next few years. In addition, there are, there've been capital restrictions from China towards, investment, Chinese investments abroad, which means that Chinese investments to Europe, to the EU, are actually in free fall. Between 2016 and 2019, we went from 38 billion euro to 12 billion euros. And this year, of course, is going to be even less due to COVID-19. And there's a mixed of reasons, capital restrictions, policies in China, lack of course, exchanges, particularly this year, but also some restrictions maybe on the European front. So it's not really looking very good. I mean, in terms of, and also we are not even able to negotiate, save alone sign a bilateral investment treaty. I mean, even at the September 14 summit between President Xi and the leaders of Europe, including Chancellor Merkel, they couldn't agree. So, what I'm trying to say here is that, I make a distinction between opportunistic investments and strategic investments. And the BRI to me belong to the second group. I don't think the strategic investments will compensate the drop of opportunistic investments, particularly in the private sector, unless, of course, some big projects like the ones you mentioned, John, really take off, especially the very mysterious, Hungary deal of the sort of Belgrade Budapest train line. We're not out of they're not out of the wood yet. Also, there's obviously we're facing a very strange year ahead again after a very difficult period due to the pandemic, and the EU has announced a huge budget, 750 billion euro, to sort of relaunch the EU economy. Now, what is the BRI going to do about that? It's like Italy is going to get 200 billion euro to relaunch its companies, its infrastructures, the bridge of Genoa. And this is going to be a big deal. I mean, it's not going to be the Marshall Plan, and nobody has mentioned it yet. But it's similar to a big relaunch of the European project, and particularly the European economy. I would just also add, I don't want to be too long, that there's been some, backlash against China in Europe, and this has not really, it's not directly tied to the BRI, but it's a little bit tied to the propaganda and what has been happening over the past few months, particularly in spring. And in countries, like Italy and France. And if you look at, the Pew Research opinion polls of the past few weeks, came out just a couple of weeks ago. Opinions are all down, and of course it's more difficult for a country like China to launch new initiatives, and we may be sort of looking at a very long-term project in Europe, but at the moment, China needs to do more public relations, and I'm not sure the Belton Road is going to be a good way to improve China's image. So I think that's all I wanted to say. But basically, yeah. I mean, in terms of just one more thing on the map. One of the maps that you had great maps. The one that showed the sort of the 17+1 and the connection to Piraeus. Now, of course, if the West Balkan countries, which are currently non-EU members, do join the EU, and it may not happen in the next couple of years, but that may also change the game in the sense that the European Union will have a say on many things that China may be planning in Eastern and Central Europe. But I'll leave it there, and I look forward to a great conversation and to hear Minier. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philippe. And I think you're bringing in the great heavy investment in Northwestern Europe, whereas Jonathan had dealt almost entirely with Southeastern Europe, and making that distinction between opportunistic and strategic investments by China that almost correlate with that Northwest and Southeast geography, I think is a very big piece of food for thought for us. We do have some interesting questions that have come in, but Min, why don't we go on and have your comments in response to Jonathan's presentation.
Okay. First, I want to thank Glenn for organizing this program, but also the series of BRI program that are going to happen this term and next spring. And it's been a great pleasure being part of the series. And also, I want to thank Jonathan for coming to launch this program and for writing this book. I have to confess that your project was exactly the project that I decided not to pursue in 2014-15. So in all my grants proposals, which successful grant proposals, my project were like yours, and I want to go to different places and see how the BRI projects were being implemented and being received. And I decided not to pursue that because of concern for personal safety, for hardship, and for the time away from home. But also at that point, I do feel that the main drama or the main dynamics, the purpose of the BRI was internal to China, not outside. So I encourage our audience to read Jonathan's book. It is based on a lot of hardship and bravery. And you made it so easy, but going through all these places, that's I admire your endeavor in doing that. And I'll offer one quick comment to Philippe. and then to Jonathan, and then offer my 2 takeaways from the book. To Philippe, I was first time to hear about the European relaunch, and I think this actually will be a game changer in the Euro-Asia continent. So I will be interested in reading and seeing the updates. And from the China side, the COVID really is a turning point as well. And so the BRI is still here and it's still highlighted, but the Chinese main effort has also turned inward. So internal circulation is now the big thing in China. And on Philippe's suggestions on the soft power or public relations, I think the Chinese kind of find it's impossible to do anything about it. So they'll just wait and see and let the outside image tank and maintain internal development dynamics and maintain internal cohesion. So we are again seeing this China phenomena every time when the external environment looks unfriendly, then they withdraw more, and when they see more opportunities and embrace, then they Jonathan, I really like the picture that you show, Li Keqiang's sitting with 2 European leaders, because I do think Li Keqiang's role in the BRI was under captured, because he is the one, despite President Xi was giving all these remarks, this branding, but Li Keqiang's emphasis on promoting capacity cooperation, that actually was guiding most of the projects and the financing decisions. But on that, I think Premier Li Keqiang and the Chinese economic state, they really didn't understand the outside economic and political system that actually are very different from Chinese. Right? So, for example, when China started promoting capacity cooperation, they had 2 directions. One was to promoting the best Chinese industrial technology to go abroad, and Speed Rail is the flagship technology program, right? And the other was to promote Chinese products abroad. And the second actually achieved a lot more in the BRI process than Speed Rail. And that's because I think that the Chinese they had a success in building Speed Rail, and then that kind of development framework succeeded in China, but not abroad, because I think as now I kind of deeply in China and also deeply outside China. So I feel like the politics of development in China is really different. And so development in China is really based on these domestic political groups, organizations, and the society buy-in, and that in China was doable surrounding a major project, and then outside that kind of political condition is not there. And economically, the Chinese don't think of ways like Americans, but commercial market actors as transactional stuff, right? So one investment and the cost benefits of one investment. And in China, the big investment was really formulated this way. And it's always about the spillover, the larger impact in a region. So the Speed Rail actually, from the Chinese perspective, it is actually a great, and you can creating a huge cluster of activities and adjacent developments, investments, to use Philippe's term, opportunistic investments could come in after this strategic project. But that's not how a non-Chinese market work. So I think the BRI is really experiencing this mismatch of China and the recipient political economy that's interfacing. So we are observing this mismatch. I also want to share my readings of Jonathan's book. I think your remark really undersell the contributions. The first is, I think this book, is really truly multi-regional. So it has many narratives of China's investments and engagement infrastructure in different parts of the world. So here we can find a diverse and well-connected college or album that you get to learn a lot about how China is doing outside. And I will share, which I agree, but it's from the book, that in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, China's projects are big but few, and the impact is very limited. But in Southeast Asia, countries are much more active and adaptive, and you do see the activities are moving faster and benefiting more local developments. In South Asia, Pakistan was just a mess, and Sri Lanka, really it's a mess that China stepped in. And Africa is again a very different story. And the second major contribution I see this book is this historical discussions. Right? So in all these regions that I mentioned, that the book goes to pre-China colonial or imperial projects or major power projects, and the experiences of the local government, society, and the outcome. And here we'll find a lot more continuity. For example, in Southeast Asia, why the Southeast Asian countries are more seem to be adaptable and successful in participating, leveraging in the BRI. That's because they had a lot of experience with working with Japan, and the Chinese way has a lot of similarity with the Japanese way. And in Pakistan, basically the political economy was already show similar backlash from the earlier great power projects that have failed. Right? So we see a lot of continuity, and then the China story comes in. Right? So I want to asking Jonathan, now that you have done this multi-regional and cross-time analysis, and my first question is among all these regions, like where, or not even just country, but cities or regions, what are the possible pockets of success in this new rounds of development, either drawing on Chinese involvement or drawing on the competitive investment offering from other countries. And here I want to share my research on China's own industrialization and globalization since the 1980s. Right? And I like firsthand reading through all these reports and assessments from the Japanese, Europeans, and Americans, and they basically deemed the Chinese, Shenzhen, even Shanghai, to be really difficult place to go, right? So and I think there are two elements in China that eventually kind of overcame the pessimistic views from the foreign capital. One is the diaspora entrepreneurs, so the Hong Kong business people, and they had a lot more in-ground knowledge and commitment, and so they are staying. But the other major factor is the local, right? So the local political economy, local governments, local entrepreneurs, farmers and local households, they had this like fervor or such a motivation to be part of the new development wave, right? So do you see any potential pockets of similar developments? I know China wants to, like the Gata port was portrayed to become Shenzhen. We know that's perhaps is impossible, but what else? Where else you might see some kind of pockets of success as we move out of the COVID period? Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Min. We have some interesting questions that have come in, but you've actually posed a longer conversation, I think, between all three of you who have been here today. But I would like to give a chance for those people, if it's all right, for these questions that you mentioned. I'll bring up the three questions and then let you think about them, and maybe each of you will be able to make a comment about these questions. The first question is from Plamen Tonchev, who asked questions of Jonathan in relation to Greece. First, the role of Piraeus in the transshipment of Chinese goods to Europe. What is the share of the total Chinese exports to Europe? And second, a comment on the split of socioeconomic benefits drawn by Chinese companies and by the Greek side. A very interesting question. Eugenio Menegon has asked a question about that maybe a comment can be made more about the maritime dimension of the BRI in terms of sea lanes and control of the oceans, not just ports. But on this maritime side, let me just mention that a year ago in October, I actually was traveling in Croatia and Montenegro, went from the port of Bar by train up to Belgrade. And then because enough of the track was shut down, I couldn't, like you, Jonathan, actually take the train to Budapest. I took the overnight bus with a 3-hour stop at the border between the EU and a non-EU state. So it was a bit of an adventure, but on that trip through the Montenegro mountains, I saw 40 bridges, huge constructions that were being built by Chinese constructors in the so-called road to nowhere in that location. So regarding this maritime question, the Land Sea Express that you showed went from Piraeus all the way up to Budapest. But what I was looking at was really the options for those other ports on the Adriatic, such as Bar or Rijeka or Trieste, to actually do the transshipment in Piraeus going up. And to me, there's confusion, which may relate to Min's analysis of how there's fragmented implementation of Belt and Road projects. So in Rijeka, you have the port operators from Ningbo actually working there as kind of their own deal. And if they can push it forward, that will be an alternate to this land road. So that just touches on the maritime side a little bit more. And then Ashraf Main asks a question for John. I remember Donald Rumsfeld at one time referred to old Europe and new Europe, pointing to how US was viewing the EU. Your presentation of 17+1 seems to suggest perhaps that BRI is leading the PRC down a similar path. Is that so? And there is another question from Diego Matthias, but let's start with those questions to see what response you have to those. Jonathan?
Great, yeah, thank you. I'm happy to offer a few thoughts and then welcome other input. So to the question about Piraeus and the share of China's imports to Europe, I don't know off the top of my head, so I won't invent a number. I will, however, recommend the work of the guy who asked the question, who's a good analyst in the region. And I will note that I think this is related to the transshipment question. One of the challenges that the EU has faced is that it doesn't have a common cabotage law. And so individual countries will decide whether or not they will allow transshipment to happen by foreign flagged vessels. And China has taken advantage of that situation. China does have a common policy and does not grant EU companies the same level of access as some EU states are granting Chinese vessels. So that's been a sore point in the maritime industry, and I think one that some of the European companies would like to see addressed. They would like to have reciprocal treatment there. Stepping back from the ports and thinking more broadly about the maritime domain, I mean, I think we're naturally drawn to the ports because they're big projects, and they are, as in the case of Piraeus, they can become these launching points for a broader ecosystem of activity. But China, I think China's advantage in the maritime domain extends beyond ports. It produces over 90% of the world's shipping containers. A single Chinese company makes something like 80% of the world's ship-to-shore cranes. It has, if not the world's largest maritime workforce, the second largest maritime workforce. And so you can look at individual links in what we might call the maritime supply chain. And China is quite dominant across those links. And so I do think that if, in addition to having investments in most of the world's, top 50 ports, it does have these other capabilities, and you put that picture together, and it is quite striking. I mean, it's very, it's an industry in which China has put a lot of money too. China Exim in particular, being a really top financier of the shipping industry. And so, I see all of this, in a way, this is almost, a version of the point that Min was making about thinking about the broader cluster, the broader ecosystem, and not just the individual port. And so those activities all reinforce, and they can be complementary. And sorry, the third question was about old Europe and new Europe. I think Philippe was probably the best one to answer this, but I do think that there's something very interesting in China's focus on developing and emerging markets, and whether that is the set of countries that are candidates to join the EU, or whether that's in parts of Southeast Asia or Africa. China is very focused on the markets of the future, areas where population growth is going up. And I think the case of the countries that have candidates or that are candidates to join the EU, there's a tension there too. There's a tension between some of the short-term activities that China is pursuing, things like the Huawei Safe City project in Belgrade that raises some red flags about civil liberties, and projects like the Belgrade to Budapest railway, which some of the lack of transparency around that. Those projects, although they serve an immediate commercial interest of China's, might make it more difficult actually for the countries participating in them to join the EU. And so there is, I think, both potentially a benefit to China in the longer run for doing more business in countries that could join the EU and in effect riding that access into the EU market. But there's a tension between that and some of these short-term activities. But I'm sure our other discussants have some thoughts on this as well.
Philippe, do you have a comment on the old New Europe question?
Well, I would agree. I was in government when Donald Rumsfeld said that, so I shouldn't be commenting really. But I would agree with Jonathan that there's a tension, regarding the West Balkan countries, particularly joining, whether they, if they build a Chinese not high speed, but a Chinese rail track, let's call it this way, considering that the Germans and the French were the ones to invent a high-speed train. And in fact, the Chinese high-speed line between Beijing and Shanghai has been built based on German technology. And therefore, you know, all the European manufacturers of these rail tracks went out of the China market within years. But I have a couple of questions for Jonathan, if I may. On the Belgrade-Budapest project, do you feel it's, I mean, since the viability of the project seems in doubt, according to your book, is it just like a trophy project for China, or is it something really long-term? I mean, does it make sense, or is it just to plant a flag, so to speak? And my second question, I'm afraid, is going to take you a long time to answer, because it's a big question. But you're asking in your book, does China plan to have an empire? And obviously you have a lot of paragraphs, if not chapters, on previous empires, which I found really interesting. But can China, as pragmatic as it is, can it build the Belton Road without an empire, if you know what I mean? Can it go about infrastructure projects, and one example is the two European examples are good ones, without having an empire? Because obviously in Europe, it's not going to be easy to build a Chinese empire in Europe. It may be easier in other parts of the world. I mean, we don't want to have a long discussion on this, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Jonathan, before you start this answer, this is a big answer, and I will say that my sense is that this is a larger conversation, and I hope that we can come back when you join us again in February, Philippe, that maybe we can have a continued conversation about this. We've had some people who have sat through almost 90 minutes now, and there is one more very interesting question that's come in from Portugal. So I would at least like to ask this, but we'll put that on the table. And Diego Matias, a PhD student in Lisbon, he's working on a thesis about China's BRI and FDI in Europe and the creation of the screening mechanism. He'd like to ask both John and Philippe if they think China was playing a divide and conquer strategy towards the EU. Furthermore, I'd like to know if they think the adoption of a screening mechanism as a response to China's strategy or a way to increase its bargaining power. So he said, excellent book and presentations, thank you very much. But I just wanted to put that on the table since he had made the, we only really have 2 or 3 more minutes before we have to wrap up.
Grant, we should also acknowledge there's another question from Tobias that came in shortly after Diego.
Okay. Well, let me, I haven't seen that one yet. Okay, this is Tobias Gerke. 2 follow-up questions after this excellent discussion. US-EU cooperation on connectivity. Any more thoughts and ideas on how such cooperation would look like practically? The EU and Japan signed a connectivity partnership, for example, but it's not really moving much in terms of concrete projects. The shift towards internal focus in Europe and China. Will this leave space for countries who commit to filling these gaps in Indo-Pacific or Central Asia, the United States, for example? So those are now questions, and how to wrap up. Min, do you have any comment on these things?
I will be very brief, and then leave Jonathan and Philippe to close. I will just comment on China, EU, or Europe perhaps connections. I think China actually has quite dense social ties with Western Europe, the old old Europe or Western Europeans through the 30 years of trade and study abroad, tourism, and investment. So if you look at the countries that have seen more MOU or tourism travels, like Italy, it's really being knitted by the Chinese ties, immigrant business ties to the old Europe. But also China has rediscovered in the recent 10 years, rediscovered social affinities with the new Europe, the former socialist Europe. And this can be seen by tourism, the burst in tourism to Hungary, Poland, Czech, and in my own interviews, there's business, private business viewing these key metropoles in Eastern Europe as a springboard going into. So I think so. But coming back to Philippe's point, in my observation from the China side, it does not have imperial agenda in Europe. It's much more driven by the business, social, and industrial interests in trying to reconnect with Europe more. And those trends, of course, now with COVID and with declining China-EU relations are being challenged. And I'll see how this might revive when the pandemic politics is quiet.
Shall we return briefly to Philippe's question? Jonathan, do you want to respond to does China plan to have an empire?
It's a great question, and I think it's one that I, in looking at these activities in different parts of the world, I was very struck by some of the parallels between what China is doing and the great powers that came before it. In some cases, literally, projects, a new project running alongside an older project that was built by, a European power. I think, when we're talking about the EU, it's more difficult. Like the term imperial seems like it's a stretch. I guess I would say, there are different types of imperialism, and this is something I grapple with a little bit in the last chapter of the book. And because of, even despite the sort of imperial echoes along the Belton Road, China is doing this now at a time when it faces many constraints that its predecessors did not face. Imagine trying to go into Africa and build a rail project in the early 1900s versus today. Today you have independent journalists, you have people with cell phone cameras, you have, depending on where you are, rule of law and a different level of rule of law. So recipient countries, I think, are certainly not pawns in any great game here. They have much more agency today than they did, in the past. And I think that's been one of the underlooked, at least in the sort of U.S. commentary about Belton Road. That's been a sort of underappreciated dimension, is the degree to which countries participating in this have shaped it to meet their own interests, and have done things, to take Belton Road offers and pit them against others that would like to make offers. And Min had asked a question earlier about, where do we see better outcomes? Are there pockets of, where we could be more optimistic? And I think that's related to this because, a lot of that depends on the strength of institutions within the countries that are participating in this. And it also depends quite often on whether they have alternatives. And so the worst cases that I see along the Belton Road, the things that to me do seem to warrant the imperial term, are often done in places with weaker institutions. They're done in places where China has not been, it wasn't the partner of first choice, but the partner of last resort. And so I think there's been really I'm always hesitant to make grand generalizations about the Belt and Road because it plays out very differently depending on where we're talking about, depending on the projects that we're looking at. But I do think that it does have in some places that imperial characteristic, and we could have a much longer conversation about ways in which that's similar and different from the flavors of imperialism that have come before it. So let me leave it there. And I know that there was one or two other questions, but we also might be out of time.
We actually have gone slightly over time, and I think that we have an ongoing conversation which we can continue. So in terms of wrap up and closing, I'd just like to say thank you to all of you, several dozen who came and asked questions, who joined us for this virtual event. Special thanks to Jonathan Hillman for talking about his new book, The Emperor's New Road, China and the Project of the Century. And thanks also to our discussants, Philippe, who joined us this afternoon from Paris, 6 time zones away, and to Minière, who joined this morning from Boston, Massachusetts. Our appreciation goes to Daniela Caruso and to the Center for the Study of Europe at Boston University for hosting this event. A recording of this event will be posted on the website at the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University under the series label, Assessing China's Belt and Road Initiative. I'm Grant Rhode from the Pardee School at BU, wishing that you all stay safe and well. Thank you very much.